Well, what a delight. I think we've done a decent job building up the informational base about Cuba, about the different aspects that were somewhat murky. The Bay of Pigs that Don Boning carefully went over, the cultural background and the leadership style of Castro, which is so important to Castro. You don't really hear that about leadership styles except around Castro. Tim Naftali bringing us the international incidences and events that were motivating Khrushchev. I loved learning that Castro really didn't even know why missiles were being put on Cuba and said he didn't need them. So we learned that there were other motivating factors surrounding that, which I think is critical. And Jean Petit, actually on site during the missile crisis, I mean, that you can't beat that, and we now understand that better in geopolitical sense. And then Umberto Fontava pretty much laying it out about the fact that this is a dictatorial, tyrannical regime that has restricted free press, that has prevented parliamentary government, that spies on its own citizens, and has been living a huge propagandistic lie for 47 years, sort of a leftover artifact from the Cold War and Soviet propaganda. So the point would be then, of course, is what we really want to know with the current events that have really put our conference on the map, that we were lucky enough, as people say, to choose Fidel Castro for this year's Raleigh International Spy Conference. What's next? We know some things, and we need to find out from the experts what else do we need to know as events unfold in Cuba. And to that extent, we are delighted to have as our keynote speaker Brian Latell. He's a Latin American Caribbean specialist for CIA. He was National Intelligence Council, kept up with Latin American developments. He's a senior research associate at the Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami, and he's on leave as senior associate in the Americas program for the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington until this month, I believe, Brian. But he was National Intelligence Officer for Latin America from 1990 to 94. So he was right there on site, too, trying to decipher what was going on in Cuba and with Castro. And he was, again, after that, director of the Center for the Study of Intelligence. And he teaches at Georgetown, and he's an adjunct professor and is involved with the Hoover Institution. But the big thing that Brian's done is write the book at the right time, after Fidel, the inside story of Castro's regime and Cuba's next leader. So without further ado, Brian Latell.
Well, thank you very much, Bernie. That was a very warm introduction. I'm very grateful. The book, as Bernie said, it has a pretty catchy title for the moment. After Fidel, the inside story of Castro's regime and Cuba's next leader. Well, that next leader now is running Cuba. It's Raul Castro. The book is the first, it's a study of the Castro brothers, of their very strange, psychologically complicated relationship. And it's also the first biography ever written of Raul Castro in any language, in English or in Spanish. I've really exhaustively researched it, and I could not find any more than a couple of hundred words of biography of Raul Castro ever written anyplace. So this is the first book of its kind. My publishers, over my strenuous objections, persuaded me that this was the right title, After Fidel. And they were right, it turns out. But I was working with a different title. The title I was working with was My Brother's Keeper, because the book is really about this exotic, strange, layered, psychologically odd relationship between the brothers, each being a keeper of the other, which I'll explain about further. But isn't it good that my publishers got their way, that the book is called After Fidel? And you know, there's another interesting aspect to the title. There's really a double entendre that I'd like to explain to you. I was after Fidel for many, many years. I was tracking him. I was following him in a sense. I was reading every word that he uttered or listening to every word that he uttered. And that was my assignment as a young CIA officer beginning in 1964 when I was put on the Cuba desk. And it was the only job I wanted. I really wanted to be on the Cuba desk because the Cuban Revolution and the Castros were so fascinating. So I was after Fidel. I was tracking him. I was trying to get into his boots. One of my early bosses actually told me that. He said, you've got to get into his boots, figuratively speaking. You've got to sense what it feels like to be under that beard of his. You've got to get into his mind and into his psychology. So I was literally after Fidel, and I've continued to be after Fidel now all the way to his waning moments. It wasn't long before the Cuban intelligence service learned about me, and it wasn't long after that they were after Latell. It became a reciprocal kind of situation. I was tracking him, and they were tracking me, and I can tell you a lot of interesting stories about that. As Bernie told you, I taught at Georgetown University for 25 years. On more than one occasion, there were Cuban intelligence agents enrolled in my classes. And they were taking notes, transcribing my lectures, the contents of my lectures about Fidel were sent to him, not just to Cuban intelligence, not just to middle-ranking officers in Cuban intelligence, but to him, because I detected some things that I had told my students in class are things that I never spoke about anywhere else. And on a couple of occasions, Fidel Castro spoke about those things that I'd been saying about him only to my students. So I was able to track exactly where his information came from. So we were tracking each other. I tell a story in the book that a lot of people like about a mango tree. I won't recount it now, but suffice to say that Fidel and I, over the years, actually had secret communications with each other. Communications that even the CIA never knew about. I was talking about him, and he was responding to me in speeches. I would say things critical of him, revealing of his personality and his psychology, and I offended him. I stimulated him to respond, and I tell at least one story about that in the book. I worked, sad to say, I worked with Ana Belén Montes, the highest level Cuban spy in the U.S. intelligence community. She was a Cuban analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency. We worked together very closely. I'm sad to say that I never suspected that she was working for the Cuban government. But looking back on it, I should have. It's one of my greatest regrets. I should have put a few little clues together, and I didn't. No, but none of us did until it was really too late. But Cuban intelligence has been watching and following me, and they've been running little disinformation operations against me. The most recent one was a little propaganda disinformation operation they ran against me when I was doing some work in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a few years ago. But they're good. As you heard from someone else, from John Sullivan this morning, they are really good. The subject of this conference is very, very appropriate. They're one of the best intelligence services in the world. They're small relative to American or Russian or British intelligence. They're small. They're comparable in a way to Israeli intelligence. They're very focused on a couple of one or two very core central issues. And they do those missions very, very well.